This workshop, of course, has had three broad objectives: to help us understand what climate security means to us as a nation, to reinforce our capacity to work together at every level in response to climate-related challenges, and to set the scene for us to mainstream the implementation of multidisciplinary and multicultural humanitarian responses to the climate challenges we are facing now and in the future. In his opening remarks, the Honourable Prime Minister stated clearly that climate change is a grave threat to Fiji and the entire planet, in fact an existential threat. We in fact sometimes toss the phrase existential threat about quite a lot, and I fear sometimes that we use it so often that we lose sight of its meaning. But the Prime Minister used it to remind us of the power and destructive force of the enemy we face, and we need to actually remind ourselves that we are dealing with a threat to our very own existence, to the existence of species, of land masses, of life as we know it on this planet. And indeed, climate change presents not only the most serious, but the most all-encompassing national security threat we have ever faced. Even if the world achieves a net zero emissions by the life or death 2050 deadline, the science tells us, due to the damage already done, climate impact will become far more severe before they abate. The seas will continue to rise, storms will become stronger, droughts will become longer, weather patterns will change. In fact, unchecked, those impacts will steal the lives and livelihoods of our people. In some cases, the rising seas will steal that very land that we've called home for generations, leading to an accompanying risk and rise in climate-induced migration from internally displaced persons. That will put pressure on land. It will place pressure on population centers. It will place pressure on resources. And if we do not adapt to it, will place crushing restrictions on our nation's economic potential. We of course cannot let that happen. We have to adapt. We consider by numbers what Fiji is faced with. Working with the World Bank, we conducted a climate vulnerability assessment of the country. It was determined that it required $9.3 billion to climate-proof Fiji's current development over the next 10 years. That was a daunting figure before the COVID-19 pandemic decimated our tourism industry and brought our economy to a staggering contraction. Now, with the government revenues gutted, funding sustainable, resilient development, in fact, has become a Herculean task. But when you consider the alternatives, is climatic devastation, what choices do we have? The costs of doing nothing actually are greater than they appear on the surface. Say a bridge is washed away by a storm. On its face, that represents a major loss of an investment. But what happens next? A community who relied on that bridge is now cut off from their nation. Their access to food, services, jobs, and essentials could be severed. Through no fault of their own, climate impacts will have pushed them to the fringes of society, robbed them of their jobs, their way of life, and their access to their nation. We can guess where that road leads. When economic opportunities actually wane or vanish, violence and lawlessness too often fill the void, breeding more serious challenges for our nation's security. With the costly compounding nature of this threat in mind, our Prime Minister called us to action. Specifically for us in government, he directed us to work better among ourselves and together with the rest of Fiji and the world. Of course, that should go without saying, and I'm sure that many of us in this room are thinking, well, of course we'll work together, we always do. But the Prime Minister was actually calling us to do far more than we have ever done, to actively break down the barriers and the rivalries and turf war among ministries and other institutions that inhibit full cooperation and that can thwart our progress, and to bring on board the specific knowledge and expertise within each ministry, our statutory bodies, our public enterprises, the private sector, and the community, and at the community level. We have never faced a threat like climate change. Setting up for a business as usual approach would be total folly. No one person, no one ministry, no one entity, no one department holds all the answers. That is why we must act selflessly and cooperatively for the good of the country and for every Fijian. We've made a good start in Fiji by mainstreaming climate considerations into our national development plans. We are one of the first countries in the world to bring our climate change unit into our Ministry of Economy and to ingrain our climate action agenda at the heart of our development. We of course, as I said, we're one of the first countries in the world to bring our climate change unit into our Ministry of Economy to ingrain our climate action agenda at the heart of our development. We recently launched the revised draft of our groundbreaking climate change bill, which is now available online. After the first round of consultations, hundreds of submissions from the public, our international partners, climate researchers, and within government. And we are now also making great progress in implementing a number of mitigation and adaptation projects that require different parts of the government to work closely together. We can take pride in that, but I think we need to do a lot better. We need to make that cooperation something we do consciously and assertively. The recent presidential election in the United States, which elected former Vice President Joseph Biden, signals a renewed commitment by the United States to climate action. With the Americans now fully engaged in the fight against climate change, the entire world is back on track. And we're equally pleased that one of the President-elect Biden's first acts was to appoint a friend of Fiji, former Secretary of State John Kerry, to head up the American climate response. What does that tell us? It tells us that a full and proper global response to the climate crisis will involve so many moving parts, so many pieces that must interlock and move together, and it needs a single unified point of leadership and coordination. All elements of government must be in sync, and government must use with greater effect all the tools at its disposal. Only then will we be able to stand out together and hand our children and our grandchildren a safer and more resilient nation. Fiji may work on a different scale than the world's largest economies, but we face the same challenges, and indeed many would argue that our challenges are even greater because we are the cold face of climate change. I believe that our tabletop exercises and the various scenarios we developed in response to a water crisis have shown us that collectively we have the capacity to mobilize an enormous variety of resources that are available to us from across the system. But we need to turn the lessons of those exercises into reality, and we need to keep the need for collective decision-making and collective action at the forefront of our thinking, across government and across society at large. There are many fine presentations, of course, we have heard, have shown us that legislation and regulation can either frustrate or in fact enhance the options at our disposal, and consequently our capacity to mobilize resources across the nation or within our institutions. The presence or absence of strategically qualified opportunities will determine the levels of investment and action that we may or may not take. The machinery of our systems, the cultural norms, policies and procedures have to work for us in the service of our environmental and human interests. Finally, at the human level, we need to strive to make sure that our feelings of intrinsic worth, our strengths and values are strengthened when we see them in the context of collective action. The sum of our parts needs to be greater, of course, than the whole. I wish to take this opportunity to thank Mr. John Fix, Australia's High Commissioner in Fiji, His Excellency John Fix, Professor Makian, Director of the Australia Pacific Security College, for their participation. I want to also offer my special thanks to the Government of Australia for sponsoring this conference. We'd also like to thank Australian National University professors Mark Howden and Quinton Grafton, who gave all of us some graphic insights into the trajectory of climate change and the consequences of greenhouse gas emissions, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and extreme weather conditions. They taught us that an effective response is in fact a matter of will, and the world must muster that will. It was also a privilege to have with us representatives from the several regional, civil and non-governmental organizations, including the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, the Pacific Community, the United Nations Development Programme, Innovation Hub, and the Fiji Council of Social Services. These good people that have taught us that initiatives being undertaken from the community level to the regional level are making a big difference. Everything from working to develop the 2050 strategy for the Pacific Blue Continent and coordinating efforts to collectively meet the Paris Agreement through to implementing strength-based protocols and principles to look after our families and communities. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom and insights. Finally, I want to recommend and commend, in fact, everyone here from the many parts of the Fijian government that have a role in confronting the challenge of climate change. Your focus and enthusiastic participation tells us that we have both the willpower and the goodwill to work closely and selflessly together for the good of the nation and our future generations. I think we may have more questions than answers, of course, and perhaps we always will. But this is a good thing, actually, because climate change may require responses that are not within our existing repertoire. This means we have to learn together, we work together in order to rise to the challenge. We have to shift from telling to listening and learning. We need to embody the spirit of collaboration and build on institutional engineering to ensure that our systems and our processes can in fact meet the aspirations of the Fijian people and protect this nation. So let us rise to the Prime Minister's call to action. I know that we can develop the ways to work together to respond to this great threat to our national security. And I know we all want it. When we do, we'll be able to hand our Fijian children and grandchildren a safer and a more resilient nation. I now hereby declare Fiji's first ever Climate Induced Security Workshop closed. And thank you very much. Thanks.